Welcome to Co-Opinions, where we talk about our opinions and want to hear about yours. Today I have Nick with me.
Hey Josh.
So Nick, what have you been playing the last week?
The last week I spent a decent bit of time playing Odin Sphere Leaf Dreiser. I have cleared through all of Gwendolyn's book, and I'm also now doing Cornelius's, and I am through 3 chapters of that. That's been pretty enjoyable so far, continuing to enjoy those mid-bosses. I have also been doing some Valkyria Chronicles, which we'll get into a little bit more later. That's a tactical RPG that was just remastered and re-released for the PlayStation 4. What about you, Josh?
I have actually been doing a very good job of juggling this last week. I have been playing Odin Sphere myself. I am 4 chapters into Mercedes' campaign at this point. I'm basically going a chapter each time I play. I also wrapped up Kirby Robobot, which ended up being really enjoyable, but I will get into that later. And I spent the last week grinding in Xenoblade Chronicles X, not religiously, but just prior to coming on to this podcast, I got my level 30 skill.
How does one grind religiously, Josh?
That's when you spend 6 hours a day killing mobs just so that way you can go up 3 levels, which, as I understand, is how you played.
That is accurate, except not 6 hours a day. It was more about an hour or 2 each evening while enjoying a nice, fine adult beverage.
That still doesn't sound pleasant in the slightest.
You pair it with a podcast and it can be very relaxing, like the Co-Opinions podcast.
Ba-dum-bum. Anyways, I just got my level 30 skill prior to coming over, and that allows me to equip a weapon that I wanted to run some tests on it. That weapon with a 60-second cooldown does 30,000 damage in one shot, as opposed to my current about 2,000. So I'm just going to run around and kill stuff for a minute, because this is going to be incredibly gratifying. So Nick, what would you like to discuss today?
Today I want to talk about Valkyria Chronicles in a little bit more detail. So Valkyria Chronicles is essentially what if World War II was an anime not called Helvetica, as I believe the one other World War II anime is called. Now, with that, then, the game takes place in this country called the Principle of Gallia that has been invaded by this evil empire from the east. That empire has this red coloration. So as I watched this introduction trailer, I was suspecting that this was going to be a setup involving the Russian, something of that nature. They're actually modeled a little bit more like the Nazis, so I think we're doing that thing where we just toss together all of our bad guy tropes in one pass. The world map looks very, very similar to the geography of Europe with a couple of changes. The wars and conflicts are referred to as the First European War and the Second European War on this continent of Europa. All of this is essentially caused by a conflict over a natural resource called Ragnite. This game is a tactical RPG on the PlayStation 4, and it's really enjoyable with this bit of fusion system that they have. So essentially, before each mission, what you do is you go ahead and deploy your units. You have different classes, 5 Sniper, Shock Trooper, Scout, Engineer, and Lancer. And you deploy up to 9 units per map, and then have different objectives that you try to accomplish. Okay. You have different action points for each turn. You go ahead and move your characters around, and that is essentially a real-time experience as you're running across the map being shot out. You go ahead and you target enemies, and then you press a button to trigger the firing thing. And at that point, a little bit of random number generation takes over.
There are many things you've said here that I'm curious about. Do you find the antagonists to be compelling? Because I find these composite history things to be real hit or miss.
I'm about a third or 40% of the way through, and I'm not really sure what to make of it yet. I've just actually met the big commander. His name is Maximilian. He is the son of the Emperor and is commanding the invasion. He is accompanied by a woman named Valkyria Bless, who, as I understand it, is essentially one of the big bad guys for the game. Valkyria came out of nowhere as this invincible super boss and started one-shotting my army during this one map. It's a little bit of a cinematic gameplay design kind of moment. Right. She glowed blue, and she is considered to be part of some sort of super race, so we're really hitting pretty heavy with some of these Nazi overtones.
Did they call her the Uberwomanched? Because that'll really drive that one home.
I think it would be like Uberfraline or something like that.
Oh yeah. I like how I took multiple years of German and I messed that up.
She has very light hair, very light skin. She is part of the Valkyria who went ahead and defeated the evil Darksin many centuries back. These Darksin all have dark hair. So we're doing this Japanese thing where it's a little bit heavy-handed at times, but pleasantly enjoyable. There's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek nature to it, of a wink, wink, we know that we're being a little bit silly here. Kind of like you see with animes like Kill la Kill.
Well, and that's the other thing about it was the Hetalia. That was it, wasn't it? You call it Helvetica?
I called it a font name. I think you got it right.
Okay. The way that I see a lot of these, not even just game developers, but the culture in general doesn't really seem to see Nazism as the worst thing in the world. Which isn't saying it's the worst thing, but it's pretty terrible. A couple years ago, a fast food chain came under fire because they thought it would be a good idea for all their workers at this particular branch to dress up in Nazi uniforms for Halloween. So you can kind of see the issue there. You had also mentioned that the RNG was a little more than slightly involved. How bad is it? Is it God's Will Be Watching bad?
I wouldn't say it's God's Will Be Watching bad, but I've had an aggressive amount of save stating with the game, and a lot of that is tied to that need to go ahead and handle the random number generator. You'll find yourself taking a shot, and the shot will land somewhere within that reticle. So if you have a character like a shock trooper with a machine gun, that's not necessarily too bad. You're aiming for the character's head, and if a couple of shots hit their torso, that's not much of a problem. If you're controlling a character like a Lancer, which is an anti-tank character with a bazooka, it's much more dangerous to your campaign to have that Lancer miss a shot in a key moment. So with that, and especially with some of the more challenging missions, like the one I mentioned where they were trying to create that gameplay experience where you're desperately being overrun by this all-powerful character, I found myself reloading multiple times just trying to tinker with the positioning of, maybe if I move them behind this barrier, then this crazy powerful Uber Fraulein won't round the corner, and then shoot them all with blue energy beams.
Now, do you think there's going to be any kind of a supernatural element to this game? Because I'm hearing mixed things here. I'm hearing that it's Europa World War II-ish, but I'm also hearing blue energy beams and fighting an ancient race of people, which usually ancient races equal bizarre mystical nonsense. So do you think this is going to go in a Spear of Destiny direction, or...
That would be interesting, with a little to throw in a dash of Raiders of the Lost Ark, for instance. I think in this case it's too early for me to tell. I made mention of Ragnite as a natural resource. Ragnite tends to power a lot of the different things in the game, like you have medkits where they essentially take out this blue substance and go ahead and have it glow. The person glowing blue makes me think that the Ragnite is somehow tied to this Valkyrian's kind of superpower. The history for this involving these Darksen and these Valkyr revolves around the Darksen were apparently harnessing this Ragnite in some sort of crazy forbidden ways. It may or may not have caused a calamity, hence there's a lot of racism for the Jews. I mean, the Darksen, who are framed with referenced around the Jews. And the Valkyr apparently went ahead and cleaned up shop and made the world good again. The Valkyr eventually interbred with the other European races, and that's why the Valkyr have disappeared. So there's two different key mysteries that are kind of going through. Did the Darksen actually cause a calamity? What was going on with that? And then what was the fate of the Valkyr and why has one shown up?
I would guess it has to do with the purity of the blood, but I'm not 100% positive on that one.
The copy of Mein Kampf is a little bit ragged these days. We'll have to consult the passages.
There we go. We gotta look to the old texts. So what about this game is so appealing to you? Because I know what you've been telling me offline is this game is very frustrating to you, but then in the same breath you'll mention how you stay up very late playing it. So something's pulling you about this game.
I think a lot of it is that I'm finding myself wanting to try and see how can I adjust this to make this work out properly. Alright, positioning the units like this didn't work out properly. I've sent 2 shock troopers down this trail, and it turns out that if I do that, the enemy will go ahead and send over a couple of tanks and use some anti-personnel rounds on them. It kind of becomes an interesting challenge to try and do. And at the end of that, after playing through a map for 3 or 4 hours, then it feels very, very rewarding to have cleared that and conquered that challenge that was set in front of you.
Do you know if there is a sequel to this?
There are actually a couple of sequels. There is Valkyria Chronicles 2, which came out on the PSP, and then Valkyria Chronicles 3, which was also a PSP game. 2 was localized, 3 was not. That continues to be a bit of a sad point for a lot of fans of the series, and they are hopeful that the release of Remastered is a sign that more of that franchise's properties may be coming to the West. I am a little bit concerned if I get to the end of this and really want to check out the sequel in time about how it will be making a transition from a console experience to a handheld experience, especially from a PS3 to a PSP.
Yeah, we've seen that the mobile to console experience, as much as we want them to be similar, we run into issues with that. Specifically, Type 0 is the one that comes to mind. Now, that's not to say it's always necessarily a bad thing, because I know God of War, and this is apples and oranges, because God of War is an action game, and this is a tactical RPG. I don't know what the scale of this game is. Is there massive battles? Is it usually 5 units v 5 units, or...
So I found that I'm usually capped up at 9 units for my squad. You can have up to 20 people within your squad as a whole, but that limit of 9 has not been lifted so far. There have been some missions where I have an even smaller amount of troops available to me. Those tend to be enjoyable because they don't take quite as long and tend to be a little bit of an exercise in maximizing efficiency on smaller maps. The amount of enemies you can have is not endless, but it tends to be a little bit closer to that 20 or so, whereas you only have those 9. One of the things that's really pulling me forward is just the overall ambiance, the music, and the story. As I mentioned, it's a little bit heavy-handed, but it still manages to have some actual touching moments too. And the soundtrack is done by Hitoshi Sakamoto, I believe is his name, and he's actually the same composer that did Odin Sphere's soundtrack. Ooh. So that was an interesting little coincidence.
Interesting. Are you worried that at any point you're going to burn out? I ask because you've almost hit that point before now.
I have a love-hate relationship with difficult games, where as I play them, I can get very, very frustrated if I'm feeling the need to unwind. I think that's the main thing I need to do with this, is to go ahead and blend this with other games. I've been doing pretty well with that. If I don't think I have the energy for a difficult game, I'll put on something more like Odin Sphere, which I've been replaying on easy because of some unpleasant memories of playing it on, I believe, normal back when it first came out like 10 years ago. So I'm trying to go ahead and juggle it and have a diverse gaming portfolio at the moment.
To the credit of Odin Sphere, though this is off topic, I find that I have not run into any difficulty on normal. I know that we play games at different speeds, but I think that you would be fine playing it on normal personally. I think in the 9 years since then, you're going to do significantly better. But that's neither here nor there. Going back to Valkyria Chronicles, is there a point of no return for you on investment? Do you know approximately how long this game is?
There are 18 chapters. There's generally one map per chapter, although there are a couple where there are 2. I am currently at chapter 9, so I think I've essentially reached that point of no return where I'm really said I'm going to try and beat the game. Realistically, though, it gets into, are you putting bad money in after good money? Is that how the saying goes?
I'm not even sure what you're talking about, so we'll say yes.
I think I'm going to stick with it, I guess, is the long and short of it. I think that it's good to have these kind of games where you get a little bit out of your comfort zone. We all have our preferred genres, so it's good to go ahead and branch out and experiment with something that's challenging you in a little bit of a different way.
So what kind of person would you recommend this game to?
I would recommend this game to someone that is a fan of any sort of tactical RPGs. I'd recommend it to people that enjoy kind of World War II aesthetics, I guess I'd say. Also, definitely anime aesthetics. If you don't like anime aesthetics, you should not play this game, as it's very much an anime art style. And yeah, that's it.
All right. So as the last note, just real quick, if you had to assign it some kind of review at the point you're at now, what would be your elevator pitch?
I'd say it's an 8 of 10 game that needs a little bit more customization, both around difficulty as well as the ability to skip things like enemy phases. When you have 20 different enemies going ahead and running around doing their turns, that can get very tiresome when you just kind of want to move to that next phase and be like, all right, where am I? How many of my people did they take out or injure? And let me go forward with that. I'd find myself doing things like, okay, it's the enemy's turn, time to get a drink, time to check my cell phone, what's going to happen next? But it's worth playing to go ahead and experience that challenge that it brings to the table, and it's neat to go ahead and have those 5 different classes. That gives you a variety of ways to tackle the situation in front of you without feeling overwhelming for that volume of choices.
All right, sounds great. So you comfortable moving on?
I am.
Wonderful. For this week, I wanted to talk about the Kirby franchise in general, and not all the Kirby games, because we've discussed briefly before how Kirby's kind of a testing pad for Nintendo whenever they want to try a new concept. I want to talk about the evolution of the platforming mechanics that Kirby's gone through. Now, I'm going to run down the early games because I wrote them down, and there's 11 Kirby platformers.
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't think it was that many. What was more surprising is I've beaten all of these at least twice. The franchise started on Dreamland for the Game Boy, and there were no powers in that game. It's a 20-minute long game. It introduced the characters. That was it. There wasn't even Meta Knight in that game. In Adventure, they introduced both secrets and powers. So this was a game where you could beat the game and not have 100%, and there were benefits to getting 100% and unlocked additional things. In Dreamland 2, for the Game Boy, then the secrets started tying into the boss. This introduced the idea of a final boss called Dark Matter, where he would be the true boss, and you'd see this successively. It allowed the idea of there's a good ending and a bad ending, which was interesting because this game came out in the early 90s. After that, where it really hit its stride was Superstar. Superstar showed both the diversity of level design, how varied Kirby could take the approach, the powers, the helpers associated with the powers, co-op being useful. It was just an amazing game, which I believe you would agree with that.
Superstar is fantastic.
It is. And that same year, they released Dreamland 3 on the Super Nintendo, which was not as good because it went back to the Dreamland 2 way of doing things, which the color scheme wasn't as bright, the puzzles were a little obtuse, it just didn't grab you the same way.
What's interesting to me with that is that in talking around with people, there's a lot of people that consider it to be a very strong entry into the franchise. And it makes me curious what you and I missed in our play session where we were not really having a lot of fun a lot of the time.
We hit it too hard. We
That's
beat
true.
it in a day.
That is true.
Yeah, we shouldn't have done that.
You mentioned the multiple endings for Dreamland 2. I remember with Dreamland 3, we thought it kind of interesting from a tonal perspective for just how dark that boss game with the bleeding red demon eye, as I recall.
Yes.
Did Dreamland 2 have something that grim and dark? Or?
Well, as it was only on the Game Boy, it wasn't necessarily that graphic, but when you defeated King Dedede, he did expel a big black mass that turned into a sword fighter, and then when you killed that, it turned into the black eyeball, and it was really creepy. It continues to be creepy.
I had no idea that Kirby was really about cutting cancer out of patients.
Yes, and how terrible and destructive it can be on the families. The next game was 64 The Crystal Shards, a game that got mixed reception, and upon playing it relatively recently, that game got a lot of flack because it took Kirby to a quote-unquote 3D place when it was really just 2.5. I think that the power combining ability that it introduced really was undervalued. It was a really interesting idea, and it may have relied a little too heavily on it, and we really haven't seen it since then. So.
Did the puzzle design incorporate that well then, or do you think that it used it a little bit too much just as far as advancing in areas?
I think it did use it too much, especially since every puzzle was color-coded, and a problem Kirby's traditionally had is sometimes they make you have a power, and you might have to go to a different level to use it. That's frustrating design. The next game that came out that we both played was Kirby and the Amazing Mirror on Game Boy Advance. This experimented with something that was really interesting, an open world. And I know it didn't do much for you, but I found it to be really interesting. And it's never been revisited, so they obviously didn't get great feedback for it. I thought it had really good character design. I thought some of the puzzles with the treasure were really interesting. I thought it was interesting you could approach the bosses in any order you wanted.
For some reason, I struggle to go ahead and move around in that open world. I'd find myself looping back to areas where I hadn't intended to loop back to. I'm not sure if that was just my own skill as a gamer being insufficient for it, which odd to say for a Kirby game, but the facts are the facts. And to your point, why didn't they make use of that more? Who knows?
Yeah, it was really interesting, especially because, as we'll see in a couple games from now, that multiplayer, I believe, could have been done really well. I never actually experienced it because nobody else I knew had that game. You borrowed my copy, I believe. The next game was Squeak Squad. It really brought nothing to the table. I mean, we played it.
It was perfectly serviceable as a Kirby game. You had the same kind of treasure collection that you had in the Great Cave Offensive, but outside of that, it was kind of a boom, played in a couple hours and put it back on the shelf.
It was the most basic Kirby game to date. I can't think of anything unique it really brought to the table. It had the Squeak Squad, which could steal your treasures, but that really wasn't enough of a thing. Cruising on past that, the Wii version returned to Dreamland, introduced one idea, which was the Mega Powers, and also brought back multiplayer. Now, the multiplayer destroyed the level design. We played through it, so we saw how the multiplayer was ham-handedly forced into it, where there would be situations where there were 4 paths. And the idea there was, well, you have 4 people. You're going to cover all your options. That's a bad design. It felt like the multiplayer got in the way of the gameplay half the time. Not in a new Super Mario Brothers, I'm going to throw you off a cliff, but in a, this is just obscuring the idea. The Mega Powers were really interesting though, but they were kind of underutilized because you'd get a Mega Power, you'd destroy stuff on the way to the thing you were supposed to unlock with the Mega Power. It didn't feel like the game really integrated it. It just felt kind of ham-handed in there.
A little bit of just over-the-top action for the sake of the over-top action.
Yes, and it was nice that they included it in the final bosses because it didn't feel as unnecessary that way, but it really did just feel like they thought this was a good idea and couldn't incorporate it in an effective way. Whereas in Triple Deluxe, the 3DS game that came out a few years ago at this point, it took that idea of the Mega Powers and just boiled it down to Kirby's inhaling powers. power. And it made really good use of that single power because they were able not to worry necessarily about how these powers could be used in ways that make sense, but how to make puzzles around this idea of the power. And the final boss incorporated that ultimate inhaling power in a way that I thought was really interesting.
What did they call it? Hypernova?
I think it was Hyper something. I'm going to go with Hypernova because I don't remember. And the big downfall of that one is that the story for it wasn't introduced until the last level, which Kirby's never about story, so I'm not going to fault it that much. But you didn't even know who you were actually fighting.
That part I did find a little bit jarring. It would have been nice to just, it doesn't even have to be every world, but just every other world to give a little bit of a hint to this is my motivation for what I'm currently doing.
Right. You saw a DDD get captured at the beginning. You're like, I should probably save him. So they addressed this dramatically better in the most recent Kirby game, Planet Robobot, in that the Mega Powers, I believe, were brought back in the form of the robot that you can jump inside. So it turned the powers into functional powers, because instead of it just being a automatic kill-all thing, you now absorbed powers the same way that Kirby did. So this robot allowed the superpowers to be functional, but not in a way that broke the game. And they also doled out the quote-unquote story much, much better. And there were certain plot points that I thought were very strong for the game. So while I didn't initially rate it as high as I would have Triple Deluxe, Robobot has grown on me significantly. I think I am currently sitting around 80 clear %. I won't give away anything that could be considered spoilers, but it is a Kirby game, so there's a few things that I really, really liked and I was not expecting. I really have found it interesting how they've developed some of these Kirby concepts over time, specifically the secrets they've really branched out on. One thing, and this isn't a spoiler because they've been doing this since 1991, you always go for the moon. Always.
There's always a one-up inside.
And it's not just a one-up in the last couple games, it's actually been a retro throwback to the point where the final retro throwback in this new game is amazing. And I can't wait till you get to it because it really made me smile because I wasn't expecting it in the slightest. I'm also looking forward to I can't explain this one because it's a Kirby game, so I'm not going to say it's a dramatic spoiler, but there's one thing near the end that I was really, really happy for. Was not expecting it.
Meta Knight is DDD's son?
No. But you do find out, I'm not even going to make up a crass joke about Meta Knight and Kirby. The idea behind it was Kirby gets a lot of flack because, like you said before, a lot of the games are considered just serviceable. But Kirby has done a lot to progress the ideas of the platforming. Superstar, in particular, really did some interesting things. The idea of the treasure collection as a game. I remember when I was younger, I didn't care about the treasure in the slightest because I thought of it as a Kirby game. I tried to just go for the end. It wasn't until years later that I appreciated all the thought that went into hunting down all this treasure, which unfortunately wasn't touched upon nearly well enough in Squeak Squad. It put the treasure in a linear fashion, but it was touched on in The Amazing Mirror, which is one of the reasons I liked it because to me, The Amazing Mirror was just a huge version of the Great Cave Offensive from Superstar, which I thought was really, really interesting. And Meta Knight's Revenge?
The focus on moving a little bit quicker where you had that time countdown going the entire time directly underneath your health bar.
And I would go as far to say as it introduced the idea of a different antagonist of sorts because prior to this it had always been DDD, who really wasn't an antagonist. He was just fat.
He doesn't have a very threatening and angry, mean design.
Which was then brought up later in Kirby Superstar Ultra, the DS re-release of Superstar that had a bunch of extra stuff put in, which included Spring Breeze Revenge, King's Revenge. It was the Spring Breeze, but harder. Because at the end you fought masked DDD. Because it addressed the fact that he was not intimidating, which I thought was really interesting. I really like how they've refined a lot of these ideas as we've gone on. What were your thoughts on Triple Deluxe?
I thought Triple Deluxe was a really solid game. I felt the design was the most fun I'd had with a Kirby game since Superstar or Superstar Ultra. You talk about Kirby design and just having a good 2D platformer, and it's really hard to kind of put into words, I think. It almost makes me think about Mr. Smee and Captain Hook, where Captain Hook resents Mr. Smee because he's in perfect taste, and he wants to be angry about it, but Mr. Smee isn't aware that he has good taste, which of course is the best taste of all. To have a good 2D platformer like that, where everything just feels on point, something just clicks as you're playing it, and I don't have the ability to understand what makes the Triple Deluxe and Superstar so much more pleasurable of Kirby games than, for instance, the Return to Dreamland game, where I thought it was okay, but not great. Squeak Squad, as you pointed out, there's a fair critique in that it has that linear thing to the treasures, and it's essentially a regression in that sense. Outside of that, we also think for Squeak Squad that you didn't really have any environments or any sort of settings or changes like that that really popped out at you. Whereas with Superstar, all right, you're in this mine, all right, you're going all over the ship, you're in the cosmos. There's a lot of interesting draws there from a 2D set piece perspective. And as Puppeteer kind of taught us, those set pieces are very, very important to kind of staging the world and the narrative in your head as you play the platformer.
I would 100% agree. The thing I think that was strongest to me about Triple Deluxe was I thought they killed it on level design because, as stated before, the Hypernova ability, it allowed them really to focus on what they were trying to accomplish with the stage design. It allowed them to think more about the puzzles, about the pacing. That was one of the problems with Return to Dreamland, was the level design was just generally mediocre. I really like the Kirby games in that it really doesn't feel like they just retread old ground, for the most part. I do feel like the incremental improvements they make in each game makes it something I am always excited to go play.
I think that's a fair call out with what you said about the Hypernova, where all of a sudden any sort of small enemy or small pieces in your path are just absorbed in, and that at that point it's just whatever puzzle you are trying to solve there in that area. It kind of cuts out that filler, and they did a good job of interspersing them in the level, so it never felt like it was just gratuitous.
And that was the thing that I thought was the best, and I'll wrap up with this anecdote. Throughout the entirety of Triple Deluxe, the Hypernova ability, the idea was Kirby was always bottomless. But with Hypernova, he was literally bottomless. You could eat everything. So to me, it was an excellent cinematic design, where for the final boss, she unloaded her final Kamehameha into you, and for the first time in the entire game, you inhaled so much that you were full. So that showed the scope of how big that attack was, and then to drive it home, you shot it back at her. That was an amazing design to me. I thought they really nailed over the course of the game, showing how powerful this ability was and how exactly it factored into this final boss fight.
That was very pleasant.
It was very gratifying. But speaking of things that are arguably not always gratifying, the big topic for this week, Sonic the Hedgehog turned 25.
Josh is trying to start things off on an acrimonious note. Josh, would you like to talk about the best parts about Sonic the Hedgehog or the worst parts first?
Let's start with the best parts, because to me, the best parts are a mild fraction of the entirety of the Sonic story. You will have a better opinion. I know you will. Because I fell off the train in the Dreamcast era. The last Sonic game I played was Sonic Adventure. My absolute favorite was Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. Many years ago, you and I played through Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and you know from experience, I crushed that game. Love it to death. I have beaten it as Sonic, as Tails, as Sonic and Tails, and as Knuckles.
That's almost a 15-hour investment, Josh.
Yeah, it is almost a 15-hour, but I'm in it for the long run.
So yeah, we had Sonic the Hedgehog 1 came out in 1991. That, of course, was a kind of that starting point for us. We didn't have things like the spin dash. We didn't have multicolored shields, although there was a single shield. Special stages, kind of interesting. I'm still not sure what was up with both that shifting bird and water motif as you moved around that spinning maze. That is one of the most soothing video game songs that I can think of, though, is that Sonic 1 special stage music. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 introduced Tails. Did you ever play Sonic the Hedgehog 2 co-op as a kid, Josh?
I did not, because playing co-op games when I was younger involved playing games with my brother. And my brother and I have an arguably tumultuous relationship. And the last thing you ever want to do, you are not the oldest child. So you know exactly what it's like not to be the first player.
That's correct. The squabbling over who gets which Ninja Turtle is one I remember well from my childhood.
Exactly. So I didn't want to be like, all right, well, I am Sonic because I'm the first player, so you can be this invincible tail creature, which is better in every possible way, but nobody wants to be him.
Well, I think it's not quite better in every possible way just because the camera never really focuses on that other player. I think that's the main thing that would always stick in kids' heads when they were younger is they wanted their character to be the focus of the adventure rather than being the support staff.
Makes sense.
So Sonic the Hedgehog 2 came out in 92, 3 in 93, and then Knuckles in 94. So we had kind of a 4-year golden period for Sonic the Hedgehog there. I am a fan of a lot of the modern Sonic games, but I don't think anyone would disagree with that statement of being a golden period when you look at the reach, you look at the sales volume, and the general cultural impact of Sonic the Hedgehog at that time. Pictures of Tupac playing Sonic the Hedgehog 2 with Suge Knight, Sonic the Hedgehog in the Macy's Parade, McDonald's promotions. Sonic the Hedgehog really kind of blew up in the media space at that time in all of our childhoods.
Let's talk about the golden age of Sonic for just a little bit longer because I don't want to launch into the negativity just yet. Do you think Sonic 1 would have been nearly as strong had there been a bigger gap between Sonic 1 and Sonic 2? Because not to be overwhelmingly down, because I believe Sonic 1 had really good music, but it lacked so many of the trademarks of later Sonic games. You said it yourself, no spin dash. The Chaos Emerald existed just so you could not have Robotnik make fun of you at the end. There wasn't even a Super Sonic in the first game.
I will say it was gratifying at the end when you get all of the Chaos Emeralds to see Dr. Robotnik pissed off and stomping on the End logo. That's a lot of fun. To answer your question, I do think Sonic the Hedgehog 1 still was a good game and still has that major impact just for what it was at that time. The sense of speed, especially in one of those first Green Hill zones where you go ahead and you go off this long ramp, launch up into the air into just a big cloud of rings and then land. I think Sonic the Hedgehog was a lot more focused on trying to do a certain amount of balance. You have zones like not Marble Garden. And what we're really touching on here is that Sonic the Hedgehog is not averse to doing environment reuse, just like Mario, Kirby, and other platformers are. So with that, Labyrinth Zone is another example of one where it's a little bit more slow, methodical, kind of more almost like, I don't want to say puzzle platformer because that has certain connotations to it, but it's more about you're exploring this environment and trying to get through. Whereas the first zone, Green Hill Zone, as well as Spring Yard Zone, Zone 3, those really had those opportunities for you to move very, very fastly, be launching yourself through the zone. I think Sonic the Hedgehog 1 still, even if you had more of like a 2 or a 3 year gap between it and Sonic 2, would have had a large presence. I do agree with you that it gave them the chance to grow rapidly because they were going boom, new Sonic, boom, new Sonic, boom, new Sonic.
The second game introduced some other interesting facets that you saw reused tremendously in the following games, like Robotnik's nebulously defined Death Egg. They didn't even really bring it up before you just showed up on it in the last level, did they?
Not really. It's just something where all of a sudden you go to Metropolis Zone, and all of a sudden you're flying across the skies on Tails' airplane, and then boom, you are now in that Death Egg.
This could have been an example of all in the manual where I didn't read the manual, so maybe they said you're setting out to stop his Death Egg because it does a bad thing. They never really touched on. Did they touch on it in expanded media at all?
Not that I'm aware of, other than, of course, the Sonic comics, where you would obviously have some sort of narrative involving a mass roboticization that's going on.
And when you were in the Death Egg in Sonic 2, they introduced a Metal Sonic, not Metal Sonic,
Silver Sonic.
Silver Sonic. As we've mentioned before, you were corrected immediately online when you edited that Wikipedia page, but a version of a Metal Sonic was used in almost every game after that.
Technically, I left out Sonic CD before earlier when I was talking about that timeline. If I recall correctly, that came out before Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic CD introduced Metal Sonic, tying back to that Silver Sonic and those different robotic Sonics that Robotnik has created. What it also did was had a little bit more slow and deliberate gameplay because you're going through and trying to find these different things as you're moving through time, these devices that Robotnik has planted in the worlds. To get the best ending, this good future for Act 3 versus a bad future, where everything is toxic and destroyed and the music is super sad, you have to explore and go a little bit more slowly through the areas. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, 3, and Knuckles really kind of built on that speed idea, I think.
Okay. After Sonic CD, it skipped the Saturn entirely, didn't it? I think there were some games, and we're also glossing over like Sonic 3D Blast, which I know got mixed reviews. I tried to like it when I was younger, but even at the time, it didn't feel right.
Sonic 3D Blast was really a harbinger of things to come with experimentation with kind of pseudo 3D things. That was the Genesis and Saturn game. As I understand it, the Saturn version, while having the same basic structure, is much enhanced from the Genesis version. So our chronology goes Sonic the Hedgehog, CD, 2, 3, Knuckles. At the point with Knuckles, you almost had the sense, at least I did as a 6 or 7-year-old, that Sonic the Hedgehog can do no wrong, and it's just something where every year a new Sonic thing is going to come out and be amazing. The cartoons will go on forever, the comics are amazing. Then 3D Blast happened, and that things got quiet for a few years. There were some games that were in development hell, like the Sonic Mars thing. I think I mentioned that on the podcast previously, where a creator, Yuji Naka, was not quite gung-ho about these other teams doing things with the property. You had the Sonic Extreme tech demo for the Sega Saturn that unfortunately didn't take off. And after that, outside of Sonic R, a spin-off racing game, and of course those Game Gear entries that we've glossed over, then yes, we do then move to Sonic Adventure, which came out in 1999 with the Dreamcast, I believe.
Yes. I loved Sonic Adventure at the time. I think it was almost universally praised. It has not aged well at all, which is an issue. I touched upon this very briefly in our last podcast about how those early 3D platformers, the true ones, they haven't aged well because they were experimenting with the medium, and you can tell because in Adventure there's these huge city areas that have almost nobody. The varied gameplay, like with Sigma in that, was Sigma the robot? Delta?
Gamma, I believe.
Gamma. The gameplay there was so bizarre. It was a 45-minute long campaign where the director later admitted, yeah, somebody wanted Sonic with a gun. This was our compromise on it.
What's interesting there with the contrast is we talked about Superstar before as a case where a developer takes a game and then experiments with these different styles of gameplay to go ahead and tweak that core basic concept. I think part of the weakness there with Adventure was when it started veering too far off that concept. So you start off with the Sonic campaign, it's your usual Sonic thing. Sonic is moving around, going fast, you have these platforming segments with that. It's cool, Sonic the Hedgehog is cool, everyone is happy. Until you get older, as you mentioned, and all of a sudden you're starting to recognize that there's things about the camera that don't work the way you expect a 3D platformer's camera to work. But going back to the design aspect, for Tails, then you have a little bit of a time attack style thing. That's a valid remix strategy from a gameplay perspective to go ahead and spice up the levels. The structure of the stages is different than Sonic's, and it's just that race against the clock with him. Knuckles is where I think it starts to get a little bit odd, where you're searching for those Master Emerald shards, and it's a little bit more of a kind of a hide-and-seek, slow, methodical thing. And really, of course, we can't forget... I'm sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Well, let's touch upon those three campaigns right now, because Sonic was almost exactly what you would expect. It was mostly speed, you're spot on there. Tails, you're right, it had the time attack, but to me, that felt more like Sonic bonus levels than Tail ones. It doesn't mean it was bad, but it feels like they were very similar to the point where you got to Knuckles, suddenly, boom, you're almost full stop. It changed so dramatically that it went from a nominal difference between Sonic and Tails to just slowing all the way down. And it was confusing. We accepted it at the time because everybody loved Knuckles. But when you go back, suddenly you're treasure hunting? It just seems so odd and honestly out of character for Knuckles because that's just not how he'd been developed prior to that. Moving on to the next campaign, though, go ahead.
Next up, we had Amy Rose. Hers involved trying to get away from this robot that was chasing after her that was invulnerable. I believe you could stun that robot with your Pico Hammer. I thought that was kind of an interesting one to go ahead and have the narrative focus on her. I wouldn't say that she was necessarily a well-developed character, but whereas with Sonic where you had, hey, I'm Sonic the Hedgehog, I'm so cool. Tails where you have, God, I love Sonic, I worship him, he's the coolest, best older brother ever who never beats me up. And then having Knuckles where, as you said, just a little bit odd. I almost want to replay the Sonic Adventure game now just so I can remember what Knuckles' campaign purpose was and what he was doing there with that. Oh, Takao. He was the whole backstory for Chaos. There we are.
Yeah, no, he was... When Chaos popped out, it shattered the Master Emerald. Saying all this out loud is ridiculous. He shattered the Master Emerald.
As opposed to Hypernova.
Yeah. I don't know. For some reason...
Swallow the Kamehameha.
I don't know. I'm just more willing to swallow that difference. I could have done that better. Right? I think it's because Kirby was always developed as kind of light and airy and nonsensical, whereas Knuckles was introduced as the archetypical 90s bad kid. Like, he was awesome. And in this 3D campaign, he was digging in dirt. It just didn't feel right.
I think that was part of the issue as well with this. Is Sonic Adventure was really where we tried to have this narrative, and you see in the introductory cinematic where the chaos that's being unleashed by Chaos. In that first stage with Sonic, where he's fighting Chaos Zero, and the police try to shoot Chaos, and the bullets bounce off. It's an abrupt tonal shift across the board from that very simple narrative of Sonic and Tails, good guys against Robotnik, and here's Knuckles, this person who's being misled. That was as deep as it really got, and that was all you needed to go ahead and understand it. Now all of a sudden there's a civilization that was killed off. It was almost like taking the direction of the Sonic comics and saying, yeah, that's good, let's do a video game on that, instead of easing into the deep end of that pool.
Yeah, they really just jumped into it. And with the Amy Rose thing, it was an interesting thing, but I feel like they should have given her at least a little more autonomy. I felt like it was just so one track, to the point where that one didn't really click for me. Even I think when I was younger, it didn't make sense to be powerless in the game. And that's what you were. You were just running the whole campaign.
Well, I would disagree with that statement. You're also killing the badniks as you go through, and you do the same kind of thing where you're collecting the animals that you have with you and getting to the end. I kind of view it as a little bit of a swap on the Tails time attack thing. The Tails thing, if you don't get to the end before Sonic, then you essentially didn't pass the stage. For Amy Rose, it's more of having this threat that's chasing after you and trying to build a kind of that chase atmosphere in a non-threatening way. I also liked her narrative focus where it was surrounding that one flicky bird and trying to get it back to its mother. For a character whose previous whole purpose was basically just to love and worship Sonic the Hedgehog, which we already have Tails for, it was kind of nice to see that thing of, hey, I'm Amy Rose and I got a big crush on Sonic. Don't really care about that right now because there's a flicky bird, which is more important. I, as a female character, care about more things than just this male lead character. That's kind of neat.
Okay, you've actually presented a pretty strong case for it. How much do we want to touch on Big the Cat's fishing segment?
I think that Big the Cat is a perfect... Josh, you're not going to get a career beatboxing Big the Cat remixes, although I appreciate the try.
Steel guitar is not my forte, but go ahead.
The Big the Cat fishing adventure is the perfect example to show where they were just kind of experimenting at this point with things. I think my big issue with that was having it be a blocker to the Supersonic segment after you complete all of the campaigns. Having to do that instead of just having it be, hey guys, this is kind of like Chowgun. We're just trying stuff out. We don't know what you like. Send us some emails and let us know.
If Knuckles was a stop, this was throwing him in the river. Because it was just so out of nowhere, and some people had atrocious difficulty with it. But Sonic Adventure showed when they were trying to experiment, and it went... We touched on Sigma? No.
We touched on
Gamma earlier. So I think we can go past that. But Sonic Adventure showed where they really just kind of went off the rails, and we went a little long on this one, so we'll try to make the subsequent games a little snappier.
I guess just a quick final thought on Sonic Adventure. I think the main reason it was received so well at the time, as you said, was because it was something that was doing these cool things we hadn't seen in 3D before. But for other games, like Mario 64 is a great example. Then playing it nowadays with the camera where it's just a little bit odd to go ahead and get it at just the right shot you need. All those bare bones basic frameworks are still kind of in place to have fun. With Sonic Adventure, those issues surrounding Sonic's 3D movement in that first game where you just randomly fall off the world, that's a little bit more threatening than the Mario side of things where it just becomes, let me get the camera just right for this next segment.
What was the last game you would consider a true Sonic game? I ask this because I know the last one developed by Sonic Team was Generations.
The last one developed by Sonic Team was Lost World. That is what I would consider the last true Sonic game.
Okay. Between Lost World and Sonic Adventure, why don't you tell me, because I didn't play anything from Sonic Adventure because I fell off the bandwagon, tell me what good and bad the subsequent games brought to it. Because I know there was 06, I don't know if you would consider the Wii games. I'm not sure.
I'll pop through each of those just at a really quick at a high level. So Sonic Adventure 2, we saw it kind of narrow the focus and just have those three gameplay modes. Hunt for Master Emerald Shards as Knuckles or Rouge. Do cool platforming stuff as Sonic and Shadow. And then do the Gamma-style shoot-'em-up gallery as Tails or Dr. Eggman. From there, we moved to Sonic Heroes, which had a squad-based setup with 4 different teams. I didn't play that one. The general understanding that I have from fans is that it wasn't super positive. It was still kind of trying to find that footing. From there, we moved to Sonic 2006. Sonic 2006 is a little bit of a tragedy. They were being forced to meet this Christmas release date for this new console, and that's where a lot of these technical flaws come to play. It has very good music. It tries to build on that Sonic Adventure style thing where you have this overworld, you have people you can talk to, you can go on these side quests that will open up side mission stages. if it were technically proficient, it may have actually been considered to be a renaissance of the series. But it wasn't, so it's not. After Sonic 2006, we had Sonic Unleashed in 2008. For that, we had the daytime style of stages as well as the nighttime style. Daytime was a way to bring Sonic back to 2D platforming. Nighttime was a way to go ahead and have him doing the Werehog stages. I say 2D, it was kind of more of a shift where it was the true birth of that modern Sonic, as it's called, where you're kind of jumping back and forth between side-scrolling segments and then also having a little bit of more kind of an overhead view as he's moving through, for instance, different lanes. Couple of neat call-outs there were the experience points where you would level up your Sonic character's skills. You'd have some different things like the combat strength stuff, and then also just a couple of little moves that he could have in the daytime, more platforming-centric sections.
Interesting.
You also had to collect different items like sun coins and moon coins to go ahead and advance through some of the different areas. That was kind of neat to keep an eye out from a collectible perspective. We then moved to Sonic Colors, which came out in 2010. That really improved upon that modern Sonic formula. The daytime stages in Unleashed still suffered from some technical bugs, although they were enjoyable. Sonic Colors also got rid of the Werehog thing, which apparently was really popular with kids. It's just that adults who grew up with Sonic weren't a fan of it. And I still think that the Werehog style in Sonic Unleashed was also good to give a God of War style experience of gameplay for small children. You really don't want to see your child watching Kratos have sex with Aphrodite and cuckolding Hephaestus. Watching your kid just play as Sonic the Werehog and beat up this big, bad, evil, dark energy monster, that's something you're going to be a little bit more comfortable with a 5-year-old experiencing.
I would like to insert really fast. When did the Sonic 4 Episode 1, Episode 2 come out? Because I know that was a huge deal, because after Unleashed and Colors, people were really jaded on the series in general. And because it tried to go so much back to the roots, but we'd had so much progresses in technology, that it just wasn't the same. It wasn't able to recapture the magic. So we had Episode 1 and 2.
Episode 1 came out in 2010, I believe, around that same period as Sonic Colors. It may have been 2009. For that one, I think the main issue that came into play there was that instead of just being a full homage that it tried to pull too heavily, the first zone in it seemed too identical to Green Hill Zone. The music style, the actual, I think, composition was good, but the way the sampling was used for it was a little bit too harsh and aggressive, trying to almost mimic that feel for Genesis-style sound chips. And that took away from some of those actual compositions that were put together.
Okay. And I know that I guess Episode 2 didn't do well enough because it didn't end on a satisfying note, did it?
We have not seen an Episode 3, so I don't think Episode 2 was successful. Episode 2 came out in 2012. I personally enjoyed it and thought that they did a very good job in terms of level design for that one, but those issues with the sound that I mentioned persisted much more so. And if anything else, the music for the Sonic the Hedgehog games has always been a distinguishing aspect that has always been fantastic. Imagine playing a Final Fantasy game with bad music and how jarring that would be. While the story is important for Final Fantasy, that way the fans have a connection to the music and the game as that linked entity is very, very true for the Sonic series.
Okay. Do we want to touch on the Wii games at all? Does that bring anything significant enough to the table?
I think those spin-offs were an interesting idea with that storybook idea. Hey, let's have Sonic set in this Arabian Nights universe. Hey, let's have Sonic set in this Black Knight universe. Unfortunately, the gameplay never really seemed to hold up for those. For Sonic and the Secret Rings, then the main issue was surrounding the motion controls, where moving Sonic forward and backwards. There was a precision that was needed that the Wii motion control did not have. For Sonic and the Black Knight, they got rid of that motion control issue, but the game itself was just a little bit bland in terms of powering through. It was kind of unoffensive and unremarkable, other than, hey, Sonic is now in King Arthur's court.
All right. What came after that? I know that we're getting close to current.
After that, we hit Sonic Generations, and that's actually where that term of modern Sonic that we kind of started to see with Sonic Unleashed was really kind of cemented, where you had Act 1 for each of these zones be played as classic Sonic, and Act 2 as modern Sonic. I thought that was an amazing game. I thought the level design was top-notch. They did the nostalgia quite tastefully, and both of those were very enjoyable experiences. They went ahead and instead of building on that, they branched out with Sonic Lost World to go ahead and have, as some people have called it, Sonic the Hedgehog does Mario Galaxy. That's a little bit uncharitable. It is also accurate to a degree. The main issue that I personally had with that was that they incorporated these parkour movements that I never really felt I had a firm grasp of control on. So when the game was fun, it was a lot of fun, but when you had these segments where the controls just didn't quite feel right, it almost felt like I was playing the older games like Sonic Adventure 1 or Sonic Adventure 2, where I know what I'm trying to do, but for some reason I just can't get Sonic to do what I want to do.
Okay, and we'll give a nominal nod here to Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, only because it was technically a Sonic game, but much like Sonic 06, it was rushed to meet some deadlines. It was not QA'd properly. I heard that they pushed it through in a real aggressive way, and it's a landmark for the new bad Sonic game, which really hurt the franchise, I think.
I think that's really sad. With Sonic 06, and you can kind of talk about it in terms of, hey, we need to go ahead and meet this window of Christmas so that we can get sales for the specific iteration. For Sonic Boom, though, then you have that whole cross-merchandising thing where you've made an arrangement of, hey, guys, we're going to have this big game. It's going to be great. You're going to do the comics. You're going to do the TV show. We got the action figures ramping up. You start to have the game kind of be the weak link in that chain. I consider that to be a fair criticism of Sonic as a whole, is that the merchandising has been very, very strong and enjoyable, whereas the games themselves have kind of struggled to find themselves. I believe that this quiet period that we've seen, where it's been close to 2 years since the launch of Sonic Boom, and we're just now seeing the new Sonic that Team Sonic will be unveiling in a few weeks at their San Diego event, I think that that is a good sign. My hope is that this game has had enough time to where Sonic Team feels, yes, we have a quality product we are ready to put in front of the players, and we think that we finally have nailed what Sonic the Hedgehog should be in 3D.
I'm curious about that. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric was so poorly received, I'm pretty sure it dissolved the company, Big Red Button. Pretty sure it just wrecked them. And the post-mortem on that was really aggressive from those guys, because they said Sega did not work with them very well. So I feel bad with them on that regard. But like you said, they were going for a multi-tiered approach, and from everything I've heard, the comic has done decently, but I know the show has actually apparently stayed strong.
The comic was very enjoyable. It went ahead and had a strong comedic presence to it, but it ended after 11 issues, unfortunately. The show has been very well heralded. Whenever Sega released a Sonic the Hedgehog timeline video on Sonic's 25th birthday earlier this week, then it was kind of interesting to see them focus on the high points that each of these different entries brought. So like for Sonic Boom, they just talked about how it was a critically acclaimed TV show. They didn't really touch on the game at all. What was the best part, though, was Sonic 2006 just had a now loading thing for the trivia, poking fun both at the load times as well as, well, let's just move along here. We don't really have an accolade to brag of.
That's brutal that they...
It's great that they have a self-aware sense of humor surrounding it, though.
They do have a self-aware sense of humor, and we'll only touch on this for a second. The Mighty Number 9 shade they were throwing, that was in very poor taste given their last games that came out. Because, sure, Mighty Number 9 had a number of setbacks and delays, and hopefully we'll cover this in a podcast in the future, but Sega tweeted out, "It's better than nothing," which was incredibly unfortunate because it came to find out after the fact that that's not even what Inafune was giving the developer interview, like the live stream. There was a translated line that said, "It's better than nothing." He didn't say that. That was something the translator added in of his own accord. People saw that and they latched onto it, and one of those people was Sega, who threw some crazy shade, and my favorite response to that was Sonic in the Glass House. Because, I mean, really? But one thing that did come out good of it was the Sonic Boom Fire and Ice. That was supposed to come out very shortly after Rise of Lyric. It was delayed tremendously, and people are cautiously optimistic. They don't think it's going to bring about a new renaissance in Sonic games, but they think it's going to be better.
There's one column I remember reading a while back talking about Pool of Radiance. This was a remake of an old 80s Dungeons & Dragons game that was released as an RPG back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the column was from someone at GameSpot trying to explain why you have previews that are so glowing and enthusiastic, and then a game comes out and it's a 4 of 10, a 5 of 10. And talking about how a lot of times it's really that how all of these parts add up that really kind of make or break a game. And so the Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric case, and we have an example where there's all these technical issues, but a lot of times it's just, this is mediocre design and it just doesn't quite work the way that it seems to work for each of those small components. That, I think, was the main issue that the Sonic 3DS game encountered. So my hope here is that with that extra time and with having the experience of that first game, Sunuzu Games, who did a very good Sly Cooper game, my hope is that they'll be able to have a good Sonic platformer with fire and ice. I'm not going to be buying that on day one, but I'm definitely hopeful that the reviews will indicate that it's worth the time.
All right, so that was a pretty good condensed thought of the entirety of the Sonic franchise. So my question for you is, what are your hopes for the next game that Sonic Team's coming out with? Are you hoping for a Sonic Generations 2? Do you think they captured lightning in a bottle on that one? Are you hoping for them to expand further on the 3D, tighten up the 2.5D?
I don't think that they caught lightning in a bottle with Sonic Generations, and I personally wouldn't be unhappy with the Sonic Generations 2. I think on their side, though, then they kind of wanted to pay tribute and then move on to try and turn the page, which is why they went the Lost World route. Lost World is a perfectly good game that I think is worth picking up on a Steam sale, for instance. But my personal hope going forward would be they try to evolve upon that. Go ahead and just focus on having Robotnik as a bad guy. He's a good, solid bad guy. Don't try and prove out a thing with like the Dreadful Six or whatever they called themselves. Just focus on that Sonic, Robotnik, and then have Sonic be cool as shit. Have him go around doing awesome stuff. You're going fast. Have these good platforming segments. I don't want them to overcomplicate it. I want them to just focus on having a good 3D Sonic game. That's what I think the franchise needs, is I think it's done all of this experimentation, and I feel like a certain amount of that has been a bit of distraction. I want them to just focus on having a good 3D Sonic game.
Good 3D Sonic game. With Sonic 4 Episode 1, it didn't even have Tails in it, did it?
No.
You had mentioned just now that just Sonic versus just Robotnik. Do you want them to cut out? I can see wanting to cut out certain auxiliary characters like Amy Rose, Big the Cat. Do you want to go whole hog and remove Tails and Knuckles?
I thought Lost World was actually a step in the right direction with this, and I contrast Lost World to something like Sonic 06, where Sonic 06 had a wrap-up where you played as all these different Sonic Universe characters. Sonic Lost World had Tails with you in a narrative perspective, and it kind of had Amy, Rose, and Knuckles present, but kind of a through television communication thing, so they still existed but didn't play a huge role. I think that they should go ahead and try and build on that, of just nail the setup and design just with these characters, and then over time, if this is successful, start pulling the others in slowly. I think that was part of the issue. Is we talked before about the classic Sonic games. It's like Sonic the Hedgehog 2, it's Tails. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, it's Knuckles. I think that was good to go ahead and stagger it in and not remove the focus. I think they have the Sonic Adventure series. While some people really enjoyed that breadth of characters that were present, I think that dilutes the focus from a gameplay and a plot perspective and kind of allows them to develop each of these characters a little bit less so.
Not that anybody's going to listen to this who's not familiar with Sonic. If you had to give a recommendation, is Sonic Generations where you would recommend people touch base on newer Sonic first? Would you make a recommendation for something lesser first?
I would recommend Sonic Generations because I think it's the best foot forward. It kind of gives you an idea for the aesthetic of the other games and gives you a little bit of a line to pull on. Like, I really enjoyed this stage and the remixes they have for this game's tune. I enjoy the original source tune from Sonic Adventure or whatever. Let me try Sonic Adventure DX off of the PlayStation Network. That's how I would approach it for newcomers. Hey, here's where they did everything really, really good, and if you're really passionate about it, here's kind of the order of things you should check out as kind of someone with casual interests, things like Sonic Lost World, Sonic Colors, which were good Sonic games, to the things that are really only for the super fans. Sonic 06 and Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric are really if you want to understand the idea of a 10-point scale and what constitutes a 4 of 10, as opposed to...
4 of 10 is pretty generous from what I heard.
I would consider Sonic 06 to be a 4 of 10. I think it was ambitious in a lot of ways and just wasn't able to pull it off because of those technical defects.
I heard that the final level of Sonic 06 was somewhere in the vicinity of 45 minutes long.
It was very long because you didn't have any checkpoints for those areas. If you ran out of all your lives, you ran out of all your lives. I got very, very frustrated with that segment the first time I played through when I lost a good 20-25 minutes of gameplay progress, but I was able to beat the game out in my second attempt.
Okay. And I know with Sonic Rise of Lyric, I call 4 of 10 ambitious just because I watched a Let's Play of it, and that to call that game technically broken is an understatement.
I love when they patched it and they managed to break other things with it.
Right? The game was so broken that people were exploiting the Knuckles jump glitch, where if you paused while jumping as Knuckles, you could just continue jumping continuously. Some people thought the game had such poor direction they would use that just to go wherever they wanted. People were skipping 40% of the game. And there were major plot points they were missing because of this. I always rank a game, and we talked about this in a different previous podcast, based on technical aptitude in addition to fun gameplay. This game, it was so broken, I'm not 100% sure it would break the 4 of 10 barrier because it was that broken.
I'm looking forward to playing it at some point just to see exactly what a hot mess it was.
Yeah, and you definitely will be experiencing that. Try to play it before you patch it. See if you can stomach that one. But to try and wrap this up, are you optimistic about the future of the franchise?
I'm an eternal optimistic about the Sonic the Hedgehog future. I think that they're really moving forward, and I think there's kind of awareness of we've really exhausted the goodwill about as much as we can. The Sonic comics, the Sonic music, and the Sonic merchandise have essentially carried the franchise through these dark times, and I think that things are going to move forward. You know, I shouldn't say dark times, because as I was saying with like Unleashed Colors, these were good Sonic games. These weren't some sort of amazing 10 of 10 like Sonic 3 and Knuckles was, but these were perfectly serviceable Sonic the Hedgehog games. I feel pretty good about the franchise. I'm going to keep enjoying the different media products that they have. I think it's a bright and colorful universe with engaging characters and very, very memorable songs.
All right. I have only been a distant observer for many years at this point, but I will be interested to see where it goes because Sega has taken some interesting moves over the last few years, so really curious to see how it all pans out.
What's interesting to me is with this being a child's franchise, I found myself talking through this franchise worried about making factual errors with things about like details about the lore, details about what you collect or what you do and don't do in each games. It kind of speaks to just how much experimentation it's had. We spoke before about Kirby as being one of those games that does experimentation with each entry and does it very, very well. I think it's kind of interesting to think about the Sonic the Hedgehog series as something that's trying to do that experimentation and just not being able to figure out how to do that successfully 100% of the time.
All right, well, I sincerely hope on the next go they figure out something that really recaptures people because I already know I'm not looking forward to the Sonic Cycle comics being posted online. Gets real old. I'm sure you're fully aware.
It's like a knock-knock joke where you've heard it so many times that you don't really want the interrupting cow to moo in your face because you've had that happen since you were in 5th grade.
Yeah. Oh, well. Here's hoping, right?
Here is hoping.
Well, I think that is all the time we have for today. So thank you for coming on, Nick.
Thank you, Josh.
Don't forget to get online and comment on our socials, and we will see you next time on Co-Opinions.